The porch light flickered above us as if even the house was undecided about keeping me. 2 suitcases stood at my feet. Anthony's small hand gripped mine so tightly my fingers tingled. Through the glass door, I could see Mark standing in the entryway. Shoulders squared, jaw set. Rebecca hovered a step behind him, arms folded. Silent but unmistakably present. "You need to find somewhere else to stay," Mark said, like he was reminding me about trash day. Inside, the living room lamp glowed over the couch we picked out together 12 years ago. My mother-in-law's voice floated from somewhere deeper in the house. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Anthony tugged at my sleeve. "Mom, are we coming back tomorrow?" I knelt so we were eye level. I could feel Rebecca watching from behind the glass. "Not tonight," I said softly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him to reconsider. I didn't remind him that my name was on half the payments, that my paychecks kept the lights on when his investments collapsed, that I painted those walls and planted those shrubs. I just stood up, took my son's hand, and walked down the steps. They thought I left with nothing. What they didn't know was that I had already started counting. The house looked different from the driveway. Smaller, almost fragile. It amazed me how quickly something could shrink once you realized it no longer protected you. Mark had introduced Rebecca as someone who understood him better. That was the phrase he chose. Not "I made a mistake." Not "I betrayed you." Just a calm, polished explanation about emotional compatibility, like he was switching service providers. She had stood in my kitchen that morning, leaning lightly against the counter I scrubbed every Sunday, listening while he spoke about how we had grown apart. Her silence felt rehearsed, strategic. He told me the house was legally his because he was the primary signer on the mortgage. He said it with confidence, like it was a magic sentence that erased 12 years of joint payments, shared accounts, and sleepless nights. I didn't argue in front of Anthony. I didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me unravel. But I noticed things. The framed photo from our 10th anniversary was gone from the hallway wall. The spare key that used to hang near the pantry had disappeared. Rebecca's overnight bag was already sitting near the stairs before I had even finished packing. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. By that evening, Mark's mother and sister had arrived. Their expressions were tight, sympathetic in a way that felt directed at him. "Not me. You've been distant for years," his sister said carefully. "Men need peace at home." His mother added, "Peace," as if I had been the war. I realized then that I wasn't just being pushed out of a house. I was being written out of a narrative. 72 hours. That was the deadline. Mark said it gently, almost apologetically. "It'll be easier for everyone if you move quickly." Easier for who? I packed methodically. Birth certificates, social security cards, insurance policies, Anthony's school records, my laptop, bank statements. I left the wedding album in the closet drawer. I didn't want to carry that version of us into a smaller space. Anthony hugged the dog goodbye and tried not to cry. I swallowed my own reaction and focused on folding his clothes neatly into the second suitcase. The drive to Aurora was quiet. Streetlights blurred past the windshield. Anthony fell asleep halfway there, his head resting against the window. The apartment was smaller than I remembered from the tour. 2 bedrooms, beige carpet, a narrow kitchen with laminate counters. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old air. I assembled Anthony's bunk bed before midnight. He chose the top bunk even though I knew he'd climb down at least once during the night to check that I was still there. When he finally drifted off, I sat alone at the tiny dining table with my laptop open. The joint banking app still recognized my login. There were transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Not large enough to trigger panic, just consistent enough to form a pattern. Small withdrawals routed into a secondary savings account I hadn't opened. I took screenshots, saved them to a folder. Then I opened another file. A scanned PDF. Postnuptial Agreement, Amendment 3. We signed it 3 years ago, during the fallout of his crypto gamble. At the time, it was about stability. About protecting Anthony if one of us made reckless financial decisions again. I scrolled to the middle of the document and paused, Clause 12. I didn't open it fully. Not yet. Outside the apartment window, Denver's skyline glowed faintly in the distance. Somewhere across the city, Mark was probably sitting in the living room we used to share, believing he had simplified his life. He thought asking me to leave meant he had control. I closed the PDF and leaned back in my chair. He gave me 72 hours to disappear. What he didn't realize was that I had just been given time. The first morning in the apartment, I woke up before my alarm, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the hum of a different heating system. For a split second, I forgot. Then I heard the soft creak of the bunk bed ladder and Anthony's careful footsteps padding into my room. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm here." I answered immediately. He climbed into my bed without asking, curling into my side the way he used to when he had nightmares. I wrapped my arm around him and stared at the wall, letting the weight of reality settle fully this time. This wasn't temporary. Mark had made that clear. By 8 o'clock, I was logging into work from the small dining table that doubled as my desk. I managed social media accounts for a regional retail chain, and algorithms didn't care about marital betrayal. Content calendars still had to be scheduled. Engagement reports still had to be sent. In some strange way, that steadiness kept me from unraveling. While drafting captions about seasonal promotions, my phone buzzed. "Mark." I let it ring twice before answering. "Did you get settled?" he asked, like we were discussing a delayed flight. "Yes." There was a pause. "Rebecca and I are reorganizing some things in the house. We'll need to sort out the vehicles soon." The vehicles. The house. The assets. His vocabulary had shifted into inventory. "I'll review everything," I said calmly. He exhaled, slightly irritated by my tone. "There's no need to make this complicated." I almost laughed. Complicated. 12 years of marriage reduced to an inconvenience. After I hung up, I opened the banking app again. The secondary account was still there. I clicked into the transaction history and began cross-referencing dates with my own records. Some of the transfers aligned with nights he claimed to be working late. Others matched weekends when he said he was helping a friend. The amounts weren't dramatic. They were strategic. Enough to accumulate quietly. Enough to create a separate cushion. Rebecca was a legal assistant. She would know how to keep things subtle. That evening, Anthony had a video call with Mark. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to reorganize drawers while I listened to the shift in my son's voice. "Are you sleeping in my room?" Anthony asked at one point. There was a pause. "No. Buddy, things are just different right now." Different. After the call ended, Anthony stared at the blank screen for a long time. "Is Dad mad at you?" he asked. "No," I said carefully. Dad made a choice. He nodded like he understood more than he should at 9 years old. Later that night, I opened the scanned post-nuptial agreement again. 3 years ago, Mark had been the one panicking. His cryptocurrency investment had imploded in a week, and we almost missed a mortgage payment. I had been the steady one then. The practical one. "We need safeguards," I told him back then. He signed without arguing. He trusted me to fix the chaos he created. I scrolled slowly this time. Clause 12 wasn't long. It didn't need to be, if either party intentionally transferred, concealed, or restructured marital assets in a way that compromised the financial security of the other spouse or minor child, the non-breaching party retained the right to initiate an immediate review and protective freeze of related shared assets. At the time, it felt like an insurance policy. Now it felt like a loaded mechanism. I didn't activate anything. Not yet. Instead, I created a spreadsheet. Dates. Transfers. New account numbers. Insurance policy updates. I remembered Mark mentioning he had updated some paperwork recently. I requested copies of our joint insurance statements through the online portal and compared beneficiary changes. Rebecca's name appeared as an additional contact on one document. Not illegal, but premature. They were rearranging the future while I was still legally his wife. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Photos started appearing online. Mark and Rebecca at a rooftop bar downtown. Rebecca captioned one post. Fresh starts require courage. Courage. I resisted the urge to respond. Silence was heavier than any comment I could leave. At the grocery store one Saturday, I ran into a mutual friend. I heard you're taking some space, she said awkwardly. That's one way to put it. She hesitated. Mark seems happy. I smiled politely. I'm sure he does. Back in the apartment parking lot, I sat in the driver's seat longer than necessary. They thought this was over. They thought displacement meant defeat. But something inside me had shifted the night I first saw that secondary account. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even revenge. It was clarity. If Mark wanted to rewrite the story, he would have to account for every line we wrote together. That Sunday evening, I received an email notification. Subject: Mortgage Account Update. I opened it immediately. A request had been submitted to modify certain terms of the home loan. Nothing drastic. Just a restructuring of payment allocations. He was moving pieces. Not removing me entirely. Not yet. But preparing. I forwarded the email to a new folder I created. Documentation. Anthony came into the kitchen holding his math worksheet. Mom, can you help me with this? I closed the laptop. Yes. We sat together at the table. Fractions. Word problems. Simple equations with predictable outcomes. I envied their certainty. When he went to bed, I returned to the laptop and reopened Clause 12. I read it slowly, line by line. Mark had believed he was simplifying his life. Rebecca believed she understood the law. They both believed I was reacting emotionally. They had no idea I was building a case. And I had time. 3 months after we moved into the apartment, Mark filed for divorce. I found out through an email notification from the county court portal before he even called. Petitioner. Mark Collins. Respondent. Jennifer Collins. Grounds cited. Irreconcilable differences. He texted 15 minutes later. I didn't want you to be blindsided. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I wasn't. The paperwork was clean. Clinical. Efficient. He requested joint legal custody, but primary physical custody remained to be determined. He also proposed selling the house and dividing remaining equity after adjustments. Adjustments. That word again. That night, I didn't open Clause 12. Instead, I opened every shared account statement from the past 18 months and printed them. I laid them across the dining table like pieces of a puzzle. Anthony was asleep in the next room. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic from the highway. The transfers had grown larger over time. Small savings reallocations had turned into structured shifts. Funds routed into accounts I did not co-own. Insurance beneficiaries modified. A retirement contribution partially withdrawn and redeposited into a different vehicle. None of it screamed fraud, but it whispered strategy. I circled dates with a red pen. Then I logged into the mortgage portal again. The restructuring request had been approved. Monthly payments were slightly lower now. The amortization schedule adjusted. It wasn't illegal to refinance or restructure during a marriage. But it became complicated when one spouse wasn't informed. The following weekend, Anthony went to Mark's house for the first overnight visit since the separation. He packed carefully, choosing 2 t-shirts and his favorite hoodie. Do I have to call her Aunt Rebecca? He asked quietly. No, I said. You don't have to call anyone anything that makes you uncomfortable. When I dropped him off, Rebecca answered the door. She smiled in a way that suggested she had practiced it. Hi, Jennifer. I nodded politely. Anthony will need his inhaler before bed. Of course, she said. We've prepared his room. Prepared. I glanced past her shoulder. The hallway looked different. The artwork rearranged. The throw pillows replaced. The house already carried her aesthetic. Mark appeared behind her. We'll have him back Sunday at 6? I studied his face, searching for hesitation. There was none. On the drive back to the apartment, I felt something unfamiliar. Not sadness. Displacement. He had replaced me faster than the paint on the walls could dry. Sunday evening. Anthony returned quieter than usual. Dad says they might redo the kitchen, he said casually while unpacking his bag. Did you have fun? He shrugged. It's weird. I didn't press. Later that night, I checked social media. Rebecca had posted a photo from our backyard. The caption read, "Building something stable." Stable. I zoomed in. The patio furniture had been replaced. The grill moved. Even the herb planters I had built with Anthony were gone. That was when I understood something clearly. They weren't just living in the house. They were rebranding it. The next week, Mark's attorney sent over preliminary settlement terms. Sell the house. Split remaining equity after documented personal contributions. Each party retains individual retirement accounts. Certain savings classified as separate due to non-marital allocation. Non-marital. I reread that phrase 3 times. Attached to the email was an itemized spreadsheet from Mark's side. Several transfers had been categorized as individual investment accounts. I compared the dates to my printed statements. Those accounts had been funded during the marriage. I opened a new document and began drafting a response, not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. I requested full documentation for each reclassified asset. I asked for confirmation of beneficiary changes. I asked for clarification on the mortgage restructuring timeline. Within 24 hours, Mark called. "Why are you dragging this out?" he demanded. "I'm reviewing the terms." "You don't need to dissect everything." "Yes, I do." There was a pause. "Rebecca says this is standard." "Rebecca says." I leaned back in my chair. "Rebecca isn't my attorney." Silence. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said finally. "No," I replied evenly. "I'm making it accurate." After I hung up, I opened Clause 12 again. This time, I read it out loud. If either party intentionally transferred, concealed, or restructured marital assets in a manner that compromised the financial security of the other spouse or minor child. The phrase financial security echoed in my mind. Anthony's college fund had not grown in 6 months. I checked. Contributions had stopped. I closed my eyes briefly. Mark had told me not to complicate things, but he had already complicated them. He believed I would negotiate from emotion. He believed urgency would pressure me into agreement. What he didn't understand was that I was no longer reacting to his decisions. I was tracking them. 2 years, I told myself quietly. Not in bitterness, in patience. If he continued moving assets, restructuring loans, and reclassifying funds under the assumption that I wouldn't contest it, he was building the case himself, and I was documenting every brick. The first mediation session was scheduled 6 months after Mark filed for divorce. We sat across from each other in a neutral conference room in downtown Denver. Beige walls, a polished table, a pitcher of water between us. Rebecca wasn't there, but her influence was... Mark looked composed, confident. His attorney shuffled a stack of documents neatly clipped and highlighted. I placed my own folder on the table, thicker, heavier. The mediator began with routine questions about custody arrangements and division of assets. I answered calmly. Factually, Anthony's schooling, his medical history, his schedule. Mark spoke about maintaining stability. I almost smiled at that word again. When the discussion turned to the house, his attorney leaned forward. My client proposes listing the property immediately and dividing the adjusted equity after subtracting documented individual financial contributions. Adjusted how? I asked. Certain deposits made into secondary accounts and retirement vehicles were personal investments. I slid a printed statement across the table. Those deposits were funded from our joint checking account, I said. During the marriage, his attorney glanced at it briefly. Intent matters. It does, I replied evenly. Mark shifted in his seat. You're acting like I stole something. I'm acting like I read the statements. Silence settled across the table. The mediator intervened, suggesting a temporary pause. During the break, Mark followed me into the hallway. Why are you doing this? He asked in a low voice. We can divide this fairly without turning it into a war. Fairly, I repeated. Define that. You'll get your share. My share of what's left. His jaw tightened. Rebecca said. I stopped him gently. Rebecca doesn't get a vote in our marriage. His expression flickered, annoyance mixed with something else. Uncertainty. When we returned to the room, I didn't mention Clause 12. Not yet. Instead, I requested full financial disclosure of all accounts opened or modified within the past 2 years. Mortgage restructuring paperwork. Insurance beneficiary changes. Retirement fund reallocations. Mark's attorney objected to the scope. I didn't argue. I'm entitled to transparency, I said simply. The session ended without resolution. That evening, Anthony asked if we could still visit the mountains during fall break like we used to. We'll see, I told him. I didn't promise anything I couldn't guarantee. Over the next few weeks, documents began arriving in batches. New savings account under Mark's sole name. Opened 11 months before he asked me to leave. Insurance writer listing Rebecca as secondary contact. Mortgage modifications signed electronically during our separation, but referencing financial adjustments initiated prior. I spread everything across the table again. Patterns became clearer. He had begun preparing long before the confrontation on the porch. He had slowly repositioned assets, restructured obligations, and reduced joint visibility. Rebecca's legal familiarity had likely guided the precision. What they underestimated was the timeline. Clause 12 did not require dramatic fraud. It required intentional restructuring that compromised financial security. Anthony's college contributions had been paused. Our joint savings had diminished while his individual accounts expanded. The mortgage had been adjusted in a way that reduced equity growth before division. Individually defensible. Collectively strategic. Mark called again after receiving my formal request for expanded disclosure. You're dragging this out, he said. I'm verifying. Rebecca says, she isn't a party to this agreement. I repeated. There was a long pause. You can't just freeze things because you're upset. The word freeze hung between us. Interesting choice. I haven't frozen anything, I said calmly. Yet. Weeks passed. The mediator scheduled a second session. This time, Mark seemed less relaxed. His attorney advised compromise, partial reallocation, slightly higher equity division in my favor in exchange for dropping further inquiries, a settlement shortcut. I shook my head. I'm not negotiating blind. Mark's patience snapped. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I answered. You made it complicated when you started moving pieces. He stared at me like he was seeing someone unfamiliar. Good. Because I wasn't the same woman who stood on the porch with 2 suitcases. That night, after Anthony fell asleep, I opened Clause 12 again. I traced the signature lines with my finger. Mark's name. My name. Notarized. Dated. He signed it because he trusted me then. He signed it because he needed protection from his own recklessness. He never imagined it could protect me from him. I closed the document and opened a new email draft to the bank's compliance department. Subject line: Request for formal review of marital asset restructuring. I didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, I saved it to drafts. Patience was leverage. Mark believed time favored him. He believed that by stretching the process, I would grow tired, emotional, eager to settle. He didn't understand that I had already endured the hardest part. Leaving quietly. Everything after that was paperwork. And paperwork, unlike emotion, accumulates. The first time Mark mentioned selling the house without waiting for court approval, I knew he was accelerating. We can just list it, he said over the phone. Split it after. There's no need to complicate the timeline. Without final disclosure, I asked. It's just real estate. Jennifer, it was never just real estate. That house held 12 years of mortgage payments, tax deductions, insurance premiums, maintenance receipts, every financial thread of our marriage woven into its foundation. Listing it prematurely would lock in valuations before the restructuring patterns were fully examined. I declined. 2 days later, I received an automated notification. Property valuation request submitted. He had initiated a comparative market analysis. I saved the timestamp. Anthony had soccer practice that afternoon. I stood on the sidelines with a folding chair while other parents chatted about schedules and school events. I smiled when appropriate, nodded, pretended normalcy. One mother leaned closer. I saw Rebecca at the bake sale sign up. She said she's helping coordinate fall events. Helping coordinate? In my place? I felt the sting. But it wasn't jealousy. It was data. They were entrenching themselves socially while quietly reorganizing finances. That night, after Anthony went to bed, I logged into the mortgage portal again. A new notification blinked. Insurance coverage adjustment pending review. I requested the policy documents immediately. Within 48 hours, I had confirmation. Rebecca had been added as a secondary contact for home insurance and listed as occupant. The effective date preceded the formal filing of divorce. I leaned back in my chair. That mattered. Marital assets remained jointly protected until dissolution. Premature reassignment signaled intent. Mark called late that evening. You requested the insurance documents. Yes. You don't need to dig into every administrative change. I do. You're acting like I'm hiding something. If you weren't, documentation wouldn't bother you. Silence. Rebecca says this is normal, he muttered. I exhaled slowly. Rebecca isn't married to you. The line went quiet. After we hung up, I opened my draft email to the bank again. I added attachments, screenshots, timestamps, policy updates. Then I paused. Clause 12 required intentional restructuring that compromised financial security. I needed pattern density, not isolated instances. Weeks turned into months. Anthony's college fund contributions remained suspended. When I asked Mark about it, he said, "We need liquidity right now." Liquidity for what? Rebecca's social media showed weekend trips, a new patio set, a kitchen consultation with a contractor. Liquidity was flowing somewhere. I began tracking property improvement invoices through county permit filings. Minor renovations were approved under Mark's name, increasing home value before division, unless value adjustments were offset through structured transfers elsewhere. Every movement intersected. One evening, while Anthony worked on a science project about ecosystems, I printed the last 18 months of transaction records and arranged them chronologically across the floor. Transfers, insurance modifications, mortgage restructuring, retirement reallocations, college fund suspension, property improvements. A narrative emerged. Before asking me to leave, Mark had opened the secondary account. Before filing for divorce, he restructured the mortgage. Before mediation, he paused college contributions. Before settlement proposals, he initiated valuation. Each step positioned him advantageously for asset division. It was careful. But it wasn't invisible. I scheduled a consultation with a financial forensic analyst recommended discreetly by a colleague. The meeting took place in a small office with glass walls overlooking downtown. I laid everything out. He scanned the documents methodically. "This isn't overt concealment," he said. "I know. It's pre-divorce optimization." "Is that legal?" He leaned back. "It depends on intent and impact. If restructuring materially disadvantages a spouse or minor child, especially under a binding agreement with a protective clause," I asked. He looked up at me carefully. "You have one?" "Yes." "Then timing matters." Timing. That word settled into place like a final piece. I didn't need drama. I needed convergence. Back at the apartment, I reopened Clause 12 and reread it slowly. The trigger required clear demonstration of asset manipulation compromising financial security. Anthony's fund suspension, combined with asset reallocation and premature insurance modification, formed a pattern. But the final condition required formal action impacting division rights. I waited. 3 weeks later, Mark's attorney sent a revised proposal. Sell the house immediately. Divide proceeds after subtracting documented improvements and individual investments. The revised spreadsheet classified certain transfers as pre-separation planning. Pre-separation. I checked the dates. Several transfers predated the porch confrontation by nearly a year. He had been planning, he had been positioning, and now he wanted expedited liquidation before full audit. I closed the email and reopened the bank draft. This time, I completed it. Subject: Formal notice under postnuptial agreement, Clause 12, review request. I attached everything. Before pressing send, I glanced toward Anthony's bedroom. He was asleep, one arm hanging off the bunk, breathing evenly. 2 years. I had told myself. Not out of spite. Out of precision. Mark believed restructuring early secured his advantage. He believed confidence equaled immunity. He believed I was reacting emotionally to displacement. I pressed send. The confirmation notification appeared within seconds. Request received. Compliance review initiated. I closed the laptop. The house hadn't been listed yet. The settlement wasn't finalized. But the mechanism had moved. Quietly. And this time, I wasn't counting months. I was counting responses. 4 days after I sent the notice, the first email arrived. Subject: Temporary administrative hold, mortgage account review. I opened it calmly. Due to a formal request citing contractual protections under a postnuptial agreement, the lender had initiated a compliance review of recent account modifications. Certain restructuring actions would remain temporarily suspended pending verification. Suspended. Not reversed. Not canceled. Suspended. I saved the email, printed it, and placed it at the top of my documentation stack. Mark called within an hour. What did you do? He demanded. I requested a review. You froze the mortgage. I requested a review. I repeated. Rebecca says they can't just do that. They can when there's a contractual trigger. Silence filled the line. You're overreacting, he said finally. This is unnecessary. If it's unnecessary, it will clear. He hung up without responding. By the end of the week, a second notification appeared. Insurance policy status. Under administrative verification. The addition of a new secondary contact prior to final dissolution required review under marital asset protection guidelines. I didn't smile, but I felt something settle into place. Anthony noticed my focus that evening. Did something happen? He asked, watching me from the kitchen doorway. Something is being looked at, I said carefully. Is that bad? No, I answered. It means things have to be honest. He nodded slowly, absorbing more than I expected. The following Monday, Mark's attorney emailed requesting an urgent conference call. I agreed. On the call, his tone was sharper than before. The mortgage review is creating delays, he said. Buyers will hesitate if this escalates. It hasn't escalated, I replied. It's a review. You didn't need to involve the bank. I didn't involve them emotionally, I said evenly. I involved them contractually. Mark's voice cut in. You're punishing me. I'm protecting our son. That ended the argument. 2 days later, the bank requested supplemental documentation from both parties. Clarification of fund transfers. Justification for restructuring timing. Explanation of beneficiary changes. Mark forwarded the request to me with a single message. This is insane. I responded with a screenshot of Clause 12. No commentary. That weekend, Anthony went to stay at the house again. When I dropped him off, Rebecca's expression was tighter. This is getting complicated, she said lightly. Accuracy often is, I replied. Inside the house, I noticed the kitchen renovation had paused. Cabinet samples were stacked near the wall. The contractor's card sat on the counter. Liquidity was no longer flowing freely. That evening, Rebecca posted nothing online. 3 weeks into the review, the bank issued a formal inquiry letter. It referenced structured transfers totaling amounts significant enough to alter equity distribution if classified as separate property. The letter requested sworn clarification. Sworn, Mark called that night, his voice no longer confident. They're asking for affidavits. Yes. You didn't have to go nuclear. I activated what you signed. Rebecca said that clause wouldn't hold. Rebecca didn't sign it. He exhaled sharply. This will hurt everyone. No, I said quietly. This will clarify everything. Meanwhile, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing to address pending financial disputes. Mark's attorney filed a motion arguing the review was excessive and outside standard divorce procedure. My attorney submitted the notarized agreement in full. 2 weeks later, we sat in a courtroom in Denver County. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just procedural. The judge reviewed the documentation silently. Transfers, mortgage modifications, insurance updates, suspended college contributions. He looked up. Mr. Collins, he said evenly. Did you initiate financial restructuring during the marriage without documented spousal acknowledgement? Mark shifted. I was planning ahead. For whom? The judge asked. The room was still. For stability, Mark answered. The judge's expression didn't change. Stability for whom? No response. My attorney referenced Clause 12 clearly and directly. The judge requested temporary preservation of disputed assets pending full audit. Preservation, not seizure, not punishment. Preservation. The house could not be sold until review concluded. Certain accounts remained frozen. Insurance modifications remained suspended. Anthony's college fund required immediate reinstatement of contributions. Mark's face paled slightly at that last directive. Outside the courtroom, he approached me. You've made your point, he said. I haven't made anything, I replied. You signed it. Rebecca waited near the exit, avoiding eye contact. For the first time since the porch, they didn't look certain. Back at the apartment that evening, I helped Anthony with a history assignment about constitutional rights. Why do laws matter? He asked, reading from his textbook. So people can't just decide things on their own. I answered. He thought about that. Later that night, I sat at the dining table again, reviewing the court order. Preservation pending audit. It wasn't victory. It was containment. Mark had believed speed would secure advantage. He believed confidence would intimidate. He believed displacement equaled dominance. But contracts don't respond to tone. They respond to text. I closed the folder and turned off the kitchen light. For the first time since the porch, I wasn't documenting movement. I was watching momentum shift. And it wasn't loud. It was structural. The audit began quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. No flashing red notifications. Just a formal letter from the lender confirming that an internal compliance team had opened a structured review of all marital asset modifications over the previous 24 months. 24 months. 2 years. The exact window I had waited through. Mark forwarded the letter with a short message. They're requesting access to everything. Yes, I replied. That includes retirement accounts. Yes? There was a long pause before his next message appeared. This is excessive. I didn't answer. Excessive would have been screaming on the porch. Excessive would have been throwing dishes. Excessive would have been reacting the way they expected. Documentation was not excessive. It was cumulative. Over the next week, the requests expanded. Statements for the secondary account. Transfer authorizations. Mortgage modification timeline confirmations. Insurance change justification. Proof of suspension and reallocation of college fund contributions. I noticed something subtle in the lender's language. Potential material impact on dependent beneficiary security. Dependent beneficiary. Anthony, Mark called late one evening. They're asking whether the college fund suspension was coordinated with you. It wasn't. I had cash flow constraints. While renovating the kitchen. Silence. Rebecca said liquidity mattered before division. Liquidity doesn't override obligation. He exhaled sharply. You're making me look like I tried to hurt our son. I'm not making anything, I said quietly. You're explaining it. The following Friday, I received a separate email from the retirement fund administrator. Subject: Clarification request, account reallocation. Apparently, A partial withdrawal had been redirected into an individual investment vehicle during the marriage without spousal acknowledgement documentation. They required confirmation that no contractual restrictions applied. Contractual restrictions. I forwarded Clause 12. No commentary. That weekend, Anthony stayed with me. We went grocery shopping together. He insisted on choosing cereal, carefully comparing sugar content like a small economist. Dad said things are complicated, he said casually in the cereal aisle. They are, I answered. Is it because of money? Yes. He considered that. Money shouldn't make people mean. I swallowed. No, I agreed. It shouldn't. On Monday morning, Mark's attorney filed an emergency motion to narrow the audit scope, arguing that the post-nuptial clause did not justify full asset freeze. My attorney responded within hours, attaching timestamped transfers predating separation, insurance modifications before filing, and documentation of suspended dependent contributions. The judge denied the motion. Preservation would remain until clarity was achieved. That afternoon, Mark showed up at the apartment, unannounced. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. This is spiraling, he said, his composure thinner than before. Rebecca's firm is asking questions. About what? About conflict of interest. About whether she advised me while we were still married. I studied his face. Did she? He hesitated just long enough. She suggested restructuring options. Before or after you asked me to leave? His jaw tightened. Before. There it was. Not an affair revelation. Not emotional betrayal. Strategic alignment. She didn't think it would trigger anything, he said defensively. She didn't sign it. He looked past me into the apartment. Anthony's backpack sat by the couch. A half-finished science project lay on the table. You didn't have to go this far, Mark said quietly. I went exactly as far as you signed. He didn't respond. 2 days later, the lender issued a preliminary finding. Certain transfers would be reclassified as marital pending judicial determination. The mortgage restructuring would remain under review. Insurance modifications would not take effect until dissolution finalized. Additionally, the college fund suspension required immediate reinstatement plus compensatory contribution equal to missed deposits. Mark texted once. This is insane. I didn't answer. Because it wasn't insane. It was structural correction. Rebecca's social media went silent. No rooftop photos. No renovation updates. No captions about fresh starts. Instead, rumors reached me indirectly. Her firm was reviewing her involvement. Advising a married client on asset repositioning without full disclosure carried reputational risk. Anthony came home one evening from Mark's house quieter than usual. They were arguing, he said. About what? Money. And something about signatures. I nodded slowly. Later that night, I reopened the scanned agreement again. Mark's signature was steady, confident, unhurried. 3 years ago. He signed because he believed the clause protected him from his own recklessness. He never imagined it would protect me from his strategy. The audit wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Numbers moved back where they belonged. Timelines aligned. Intent clarified itself under scrutiny. Mark had believed that careful planning shielded him. But planning without transparency becomes evidence. As I turned off the kitchen light, my phone vibrated again. Subject. Audit Phase 2. Full asset verification. Phase 2. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply opened the folder labeled Documentation and added another confirmation. They thought displacement meant weakness. They thought patience meant surrender. They thought restructuring meant control. What they didn't understand was that systems don't collapse loudly. They recalibrate. And recalibration is rarely reversible. Phase 2 arrived with a subpoena. It wasn't dramatic. It came as a certified envelope addressed to both parties, requiring sworn financial disclosures under penalty of perjury. Mark called before I even signed for mine. They're asking for deposition scheduling, he said, voice tight. Yes. This is escalating. No. I corrected calmly. This is formalizing. The deposition was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, both of us were required to submit complete financial affidavits, every account, every transfer, every reallocation within the defined 24-month review window. I completed mine in one evening. There was nothing to hide. When Mark's disclosure packet arrived through his attorney, it was thick.
Too thick.
I sat at the dining table after Anthony went to bed and read every line. He had listed the secondary savings account. He had listed the retirement reallocation. He had listed the home improvement expenditures. But the dates were softened, framed as anticipatory financial realignment due to marital instability. Instability. He was trying to argue that he moved assets because our marriage was already deteriorating. Not because he was advised. Because of instability. I printed the affidavit and compared it line by line with the timestamps I had saved over the past 2 years. Several transfers predated any documented marital counseling, predated any written acknowledgement of instability, predated even the confrontation on the porch. Planning, not reaction. The deposition took place in a small conference room downtown. Court reporter, attorneys, a neutral table between us. Mark looked tired. When sworn in, his voice was steady. My attorney began with neutral questions. Employment history, income verification, mortgage terms, then the timeline. Mr. Collins, when did you open the secondary savings account? Approximately 11 months before separation. And what prompted that? I wanted financial flexibility. Was your spouse aware? I don't recall discussing it. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly. Did you consult anyone regarding asset repositioning prior to separation? A pause. Yes.
Who?
Rebecca. The air shifted slightly. In what capacity? She works in legal administration. I asked general questions. While you were still married? Yes. Were you aware that your post-nuptial agreement contained a clause restricting unilateral restructuring of marital assets that impacted dependent security? He hesitated. I knew there were protections. Did you read Clause 12 before initiating transfers? Silence. No. The word landed softly. Not explosive. Just factual. My attorney placed the agreement in front of him. Is this your signature? Yes. And you understood at the time of signing that it was legally binding? Yes. No theatrics. Just confirmation. When it was my turn to answer questions, Mark's attorney attempted to frame me as retaliatory. Mrs. Collins, did you initiate the compliance review as a form of punishment? No. What was your intent? To enforce a signed agreement protecting our child's financial security. Were you aware that the review would disrupt mortgage restructuring? Yes. And you proceeded anyway? Yes. Why? Because the restructuring occurred without documented consent and impacted shared assets. The court reporter's keys continued tapping. Facts. Not emotion. After the deposition, Mark approached me in the hallway. You're enjoying this? He said quietly. No. Then why won't you just settle? Because settlement requires clarity. He looked exhausted. This is hurting everyone. It's correcting structure. He didn't respond. 2 days later, Rebecca's firm issued a public statement internally distancing itself from any advisory involvement in personal marital matters. Translation. She was exposed. Anthony noticed something different the next weekend. Dad seems stressed, he said. Why? He said lawyers don't like surprises. I nodded slowly. Contracts don't like surprises either. The lender issued an interim audit summary shortly after the deposition. Preliminary conclusion. Asset reallocation timing and beneficiary modification patterns suggested anticipatory repositioning prior to marital dissolution filing. Further review pending judicial determination. Anticipatory repositioning. That phrase mattered. It meant intent. It meant planning. It meant the transfers weren't casual adjustments. They were strategic shifts within the protected period. Mark's attorney reached out again. This time, the tone was different. Perhaps we should discuss comprehensive resolution, he suggested. Comprehensive. Not expedited. Not simplified. Comprehensive. The proposed settlement draft included full equity recalculation, reclassification of disputed transfers as marital, retroactive restoration of the college fund with additional compensatory contribution, removal of Rebecca from any financial documentation tied to shared assets. The house would be sold, but the division would reflect adjusted valuation inclusive of previously repositioned funds. I didn't answer immediately. I reviewed the draft twice. It wasn't defeat for him, but it wasn't victory either. It was correction. That night, Anthony worked on a school essay about integrity. What does integrity mean? He asked. It means doing what you agreed to do, I said. Even if it's hard. Especially then. He wrote that down carefully. After he went to bed, I sat alone with the settlement draft. 2 years of patience. 2 years of documentation. 2 years of being perceived as displaced. They thought I was waiting out of weakness. They thought silence meant surrender. What they didn't understand was that silence can be structure. And structure, once activated, doesn't collapse. It reassigns weight. The settlement conference was scheduled for early spring. Snow still clung to the sidewalks outside the courthouse, thin and stubborn, refusing to disappear completely. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than I expected. No raised voices. No theatrical arguments. Just folders, legal pads, and numbers being recalculated in real time. Mark sat across from me, hands clasped. Posture straighter than usual? Rebecca was not present. That, in itself, said something. His attorney began outlining the revised proposal. Full disclosure acknowledged. Secondary savings account reclassified as marital property. Retirement reallocation partially reversed for equitable division. Mortgage restructuring impact adjusted in final equity calculation. Anthony's college fund reinstated with compensatory deposits. Each point was read calmly. Each correction methodical. No one mentioned betrayal. No one mentioned strategy. No one mentioned who advised whom. The numbers did the speaking. When my attorney asked for confirmation that Rebecca's name had been formally removed from all insurance documentation tied to marital property, Mark nodded. It's been corrected. Corrected. As if it were a typo. The judge reviewed the agreement draft carefully. Mrs. Collins, he said, looking at me directly. Are you satisfied that your contractual protections have been honored? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Collins. Mark cleared his throat. Yes, satisfied. That wasn't the word I would have chosen. But it was accurate. The house would be listed within 30 days. Equity division would reflect adjusted valuation, including previously repositioned assets. Custody arrangement formalized. Primary residence with me. Joint legal custody maintained. Anthony's financial security protected under court order. No penalties beyond correction. No jail. No scandal. No spectacle. Just recalibration. Outside the courtroom, Mark approached me again. This didn't have to go this far, he said quietly. It didn't, I replied. But it went exactly as far as it needed to. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. Less certain. I never meant to. I stopped him gently. I know what you meant to do. He didn't argue. The house sold faster than expected. The market was strong. During the final walkthrough, I stood in the empty living room one last time. No furniture. No framed photos. No traces of redesign. Just walls. Rebecca was not there. Mark walked through quietly, checking closets, making sure nothing had been left behind. For a moment, we stood in the same space where he once told me to leave. You didn't cry, he said suddenly. No. Why? Because I was listening. He didn't understand what that meant. And he didn't need to. The closing documents were signed 2 weeks later. Funds distributed according to the adjusted agreement. Anthony's college account reflected not only reinstated contributions, but the compensatory addition mandated during review. I printed the statement and placed it in a folder labeled Secure. That night, Anthony asked if we could paint his new room a different color. What color? I asked. Blue, but darker. We went to the hardware store together. He held the paint sample up to the light, studying it seriously. Is this ours? He asked quietly. Yes, just ours. Yes. He nodded and placed it carefully in the cart. The new house wasn't large, but the deed carried only one name. Mine. The first night we slept there, the silence felt different from the apartment. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't transitional. It was stable. Mark texted once after the sale closed. I hope this gives you what you wanted. I didn't answer immediately. What I wanted wasn't his collapse. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't punishment. It was structural honesty. Eventually, I replied. It gave Anthony security. He didn't respond. Rebecca's online presence changed gradually. Less curated. Less declarative. No more captions about fresh starts. I didn't follow closely. I didn't need to, because nothing dramatic had exploded. No shouting matches. No courtroom fireworks. Just consequences unfolding quietly from a signature he once skimmed past. One evening, while unpacking boxes, I found the old wedding album I had left behind. Mark must have included it in one of the document return packets. I flipped through a few pages. 2 younger versions of us smiling at a future neither of us fully understood. I closed it gently and placed it in a storage box. Not out of bitterness. Out of completion. Anthony came into the kitchen holding a permission slip. Dad said everything's settled, he said. Yes. Are we okay now? I looked around the small kitchen. The paint still drying in his room. The folder labeled Secure on the counter. We're safe, I said. He seemed satisfied with that answer. Later that night, alone, I reviewed the final settlement one more time. Every correction reflected. Every transfer accounted for. Every clause honored. Mark once believed asking me to leave was the decisive move. He thought displacement meant dominance. What he never realized was that control doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the person who understands the agreement. And I had understood it completely. Life didn't change overnight after the settlement. It adjusted. There were no dramatic celebrations. No champagne toasts. No triumphant phone calls. Just paperwork filed. Funds transferred. Locks changed. And routines rebuilt. Anthony started sleeping through the night again. That was the first sign. He no longer climbed down from the bunk bed to check if I was still there. He no longer asked if we were going back. He stopped listening for arguments that weren't happening. Safety isn't loud. It's quiet consistency. I began waking up without bracing myself. The apartment had been temporary. The new house felt intentional. I chose the paint colors. I chose the light fixtures. I chose the neighborhood carefully, prioritizing schools and sidewalks over square footage. For the first time in years, my financial dashboard reflected only decisions I made. No secondary accounts. No hidden reallocations. No unexplained liquidity shifts. Everything aligned. One afternoon, I received a notification from the college fund administrator confirming the adjusted balance. Compensatory contributions had been deposited in full. The number on the screen wasn't just a figure. It was proof. Proof that documentation matters. Proof that agreements matter. Proof that patience, when structured, accumulates. Mark and I maintained the custody schedule without conflict. Our conversations were brief and logistical. Pick up at 6. Soccer practice changed to Wednesday. Permission slip signed. Rebecca never entered those conversations again. I learned through mutual acquaintances that her firm had reassigned her to internal work, not a demotion. Exactly. Just distance. Distance from liability. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt validated. The distinction mattered. One evening, Anthony asked if he could invite a friend over. We sat at the kitchen island eating takeout while the boys laughed upstairs over video games. The sound echoed differently in this house. Not fragile. Not tense. Just alive. Dad says you're very organized. Anthony mentioned casually, He said you're intense. I smiled slightly. Did he? Yeah. Do you think I'm intense? He thought about it carefully. I think you're prepared. Prepared. That word felt more accurate. Later that night, I opened a blank document on my laptop. For months, I had been answering quiet messages from women in online forums, questions about post-nuptial agreements, about reading contracts, about protecting dependent funds during marital uncertainty. I wasn't a lawyer, but I understood patterns. I began drafting a guide, not legal advice, just lived experience. What to read, what to track, what not to ignore, how silence can be strategic instead of submissive. It wasn't revenge. It was translation, turning confusion into clarity. Mark emailed once regarding tax filings. He signed his name formally at the end. Regards, Mark Collins. Not love, not even best. Just formal closure. I responded in the same tone. Professional, clean, final. The house officially transferred title 2 months after closing. I held the deed in my hands longer than necessary. Single name. No cosigner. No shared obligation. Not because I wanted isolation, but because I understood ownership now in a way I hadn't before. Ownership isn't about possession. It's about clarity. Anthony's room was painted dark blue, just like he wanted. He hung a framed certificate from school on the wall. "Do you think we'll ever move again?" he asked one night while we were assembling a bookshelf. "Not unless we choose to," I answered. Choice. That was the difference. When Mark asked me to leave, I had been displaced. Now, if I moved, it would be because I decided to. A mutual friend reached out months later. I didn't realize how much financial repositioning was happening, she admitted. It all looked normal from the outside. That was the point. Strategic erosion rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative. Small shifts. Subtle adjustments. Language like liquidity and restructuring and anticipatory planning. But patterns reveal intent. And intent, when documented, reveals leverage. One evening, I drove past the old neighborhood unintentionally. The house looked the same from the street. Fresh paint. Trimmed hedges. New owners. It no longer felt like mine. It felt like an address in a chapter that had ended. Mark once believed that asking me to leave secured his future. He thought speed would protect him. He thought alignment with someone legally adjacent would shield his repositioning. What he underestimated wasn't anger. It was literacy. I had read what he signed. I had tracked what he moved. I had waited long enough for patterns to mature into proof. And when the system recalibrated, it didn't collapse loudly. It corrected. Anthony fell asleep that night with the window slightly open. Cool air drifting through the curtains. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. No tension. No uncertainty. Just breath. For 2 years, I waited without announcing my intent. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I documented. Mark thought he was simplifying his life. In reality, he was building the evidence that would simplify mine. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was scheduling a spring campaign for work. Subject: Notice of Professional Review, confidential. It wasn't addressed to me, but Rebecca had forwarded it to Mark. And Mark, intentionally or not, had forwarded it to me in the same thread about Anthony's school pickup. Her firm had opened a formal internal review regarding potential advisory involvement in marital asset repositioning prior to legal separation. I read it twice. There was no accusation. Just language about compliance standards and reputational risk. I closed the email without replying. An hour later, Mark called. "You didn't need to drag her into this," he said immediately. "I didn't drag anyone," I answered. "She was just giving general advice." "While you were married. That doesn't make it illegal." "No," I said calmly. "It makes it traceable." He exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying watching everything unravel." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment before responding. "I'm watching it align." Silence stretched between us. "They're reviewing her." he said more quietly. This could affect her position. I didn't create that risk. You escalated it. I enforced a signed agreement. He didn't argue. The review didn't turn into a scandal. There were no headlines. No public statements. But Rebecca's social media remained dormant, and mutual acquaintances stopped mentioning her name casually. Distance replaced certainty. A few weeks later, Anthony came home from Mark's house with a folded piece of paper in his backpack. Dad said to give this to you, he said. It was a revised child support worksheet reflecting the final recalculated income adjustments following the audit findings. Higher than originally proposed. Accurate. I signed it and returned it without commentary. Anthony watched me quietly. Is Dad mad? He asked. I don't think he's mad, I said. I think he's adjusting that word again. Adjusting. One evening, I received a direct message through the online forum where I had started quietly sharing contract literacy tips. A woman in Ohio wrote, "My husband moved money before filing." I didn't know I could question it. I stared at the message longer than I expected. 2 years ago, I didn't know what questioning it would cost. But I knew what silence would cost. I responded carefully. Not legal advice. Just encouragement to read every agreement fully and seek documentation before emotion. Word spread slowly. More messages followed. Different states. Similar patterns. Transfers framed as planning. Restructuring labeled as preparation. Spouses told they were overreacting. The language repeated itself across households. I didn't feel angry reading them. I felt focused. One Saturday afternoon, Mark asked if we could meet to discuss summer scheduling. We chose a neutral coffee shop. He arrived early. He looked thinner, less polished. I didn't think it would go that far, he admitted quietly. Neither did I. I thought if I handled things efficiently, it would be cleaner. For you, I said. He didn't deny it. Rebecca thought the clause was symbolic. It wasn't. He looked down at his coffee cup. I signed it because I trusted you. And I activated it because you didn't. He absorbed that without defensiveness. For the first time since the porch. The conversation wasn't adversarial. It was factual. I didn't mean to hurt Anthony, he said. I know, I answered. But impact doesn't depend on intent. He nodded slowly. We finalized summer dates and parted without tension. That evening, Anthony asked if he could start saving allowance money in a jar labeled Future. For what? I asked. I don't know yet, he said. Just in case. I smiled faintly. Preparation. That word had followed us through every stage. The difference was transparency. Later that night, I opened the original scanned agreement one more time. The ink hadn't faded. The language hadn't changed. What had changed was who understood it. Mark once believed that asking me to leave was the decisive move. He thought emotional distance equaled strategic advantage. He thought silence meant compliance. What he hadn't realized was that silence can be study. It can be organization. It can be leverage accumulating quietly over time. Rebecca's firm concluded their internal review with a private reprimand. No public fallout, but a shift. She no longer appeared in any community events connected to the old neighborhood. And Mark no longer mentioned her in logistical emails. I didn't investigate further. I didn't need confirmation of collapse. Because collapse wasn't the goal. Correction was. Anthony finished the school year with improved grades. Stability had recalibrated his focus. One night, while tucking him in, he asked something unexpected. Did you win? I paused. I protected us, I said. He seemed satisfied with that answer. After he fell asleep, I stood in the hallway for a moment. 2 years earlier, I had walked down porch steps carrying suitcases in silence. Now I stood in a hallway I owned, carrying documentation and clarity. Mark thought displacement ended the story. Rebecca thought proximity to law meant immunity. Neither understood that agreements don't collapse under pressure. They activate, and when they do, they don't scream. They simply redistribute weight. What fell wasn't a house. It was assumption. The quiet after everything settled felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty. Not tense. Just steady. There were no more compliance emails. No more court dates. No more revised spreadsheets arriving at midnight. The notifications that once tightened my chest had stopped completely. The systems had finished recalibrating. Anthony moved through the house like it had always been ours. He left his backpack by the stairs without hesitation. He did homework at the kitchen island without glancing toward a door that might open unexpectedly. Safety had become routine. One afternoon, I stood at the window watching him ride his bike up and down the sidewalk. The sun hit the pavement just right. And for a moment I realized something simple and profound. I wasn't bracing anymore. For 2 years, I had lived in controlled stillness. Not paralysis, preparation. Every transfer tracked. Every document saved. Every phrase read carefully. People think revenge looks loud. They imagine confrontation. Tears. Shouting in courtrooms. Dramatic declarations. Mine looked like a folder labeled documentation. Mine looked like a clause on page 7. Mine looked like waiting long enough for patterns to expose themselves. Mark didn't go to jail. Rebecca didn't lose her career publicly. There was no spectacular collapse. But the house was sold under corrected valuation. The accounts were reclassified. The college fund restored. The signature he skimmed past became the structure that redistributed everything he tried to reposition. What fell wasn't a man. It was the belief that I wouldn't read. It was the assumption that silence meant surrender. It was the comfort of thinking that proximity to legal knowledge equals immunity from it. One evening, while organizing files into a storage box, I found the first printed copy of Clause 12 I had highlighted. The paper was slightly bent at the edges from how many times I unfolded it. I ran my finger across the language again. Intentional transfer. Concealment. Restructuring. Protection of minor child? When we signed it years ago, I had hoped we would never need it. I didn't sign it for revenge. I signed it for protection. There's a difference. Anthony walked into the room holding a small jar with coins inside. "What are you saving for?" I asked. "Just in case," he said with a shrug. I smiled faintly. Preparation isn't fear. It's awareness. Mark once told me I was intense. Maybe I was. But intensity kept receipts. Intensity read the fine print. Intensity understood that stability isn't given, it's documented. Months after the settlement, a woman messaged me online and wrote, "I wish I had known what to look for before I signed." I thought about that sentence for a long time. So many of us sign things in love. We trust tone. We trust timing. We trust the person sitting next to us. We don't imagine the day when reading becomes survival. If there is one thing I learned, it's this. You don't owe loyalty to someone who replaced you. You don't owe silence to protect someone else's narrative. And you don't need to scream to win. You need to understand what you signed. Mark thought asking me to leave was decisive. He thought speed meant control. He thought that aligning with someone who understood paperwork would give him advantage. What he didn't realize was that I understood it too. I just understood it completely. 2 years after that porch, I stood in my own kitchen while Anthony finished his homework. "Mom," he said, not looking up from his notebook. "Are we okay now?" I leaned against the counter and answered honestly. "We're safe." That's better than okay. Safety isn't glamorous. It doesn't trend online. It doesn't make dramatic headlines. But it's the most powerful outcome I could have chosen. If you've ever been told to leave something you helped build, if you've ever felt underestimated because you stayed quiet, if you've ever signed a document without reading every word, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Silence can be strength. Preparation can be power. And sometimes the smallest clause can change the entire structure. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me what you would have done differently. And if you believe that understanding the fine print matters more than raising your voice, stay here. There are more stories like this, about hidden power, about family, about contracts people thought didn't matter. He thought asking me to leave was the end of my story. It was the moment I started reading it. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.